We have a very cool paddle to introduce today because Selkirk is finally going raw carbon, at least with their actual Selkirk branded stuff. This is the Selkirk Vanguard Control Invikta. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So Selkirk have kind of always done their own thing, regardless of the direction the rest of the industry was going. When raw carbon paddles first started catching on, they stuck to their guns and released the much less spin but more control-oriented original Vanguard paddles. Then, when super rigid thermoform paddles became the industry standard, they released one of the thickest, most control-oriented paddles ever, although that paddle is technically thermoformed, but really not like any other thermoform paddle. The thing is, they're so big and so good at what they do that it doesn't really matter if they're going against the grain. Their stuff works and people like it, but they finally decided to give in a little bit with these raw carbon Vanguard paddles. Now, before we introduce this paddle and discuss what it's all about, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about here you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. And please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So, raw carbon Vanguard paddles. I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't talked much at all about the Vanguard 2.0s, and that's because honestly, I really don't like them that much. As much as they will work in the right player's hands, I do think they've fallen a bit too far behind the industry curve in several metrics, which means despite them being very good for soft control, I don't think they're all that competitive anymore. So what actually has changed here? Well, for one, obviously the top sheet. Selkirk is using a T700 raw quad carbon fiber face, which is made and processed in the US, and because it's American, that means it's gotta be good, I guess. Selkirk claims it provides ultimate spin and enhances the paddle's overall performance. Honestly, I think the word enhances has to be in my top 5 favorite words ever. Like seriously, you can add enhanced to any sentence and it makes it sound so much more pro, but means absolutely nothing. Like the word enhanced just enhanced that sentence. But anyways, the other change is the X5 Plus honeycomb core, other than the regular X5 core that was on the Vanguard 2.0s. The X5 Plus is the same core that was on the Project Lab 006 paddles, for those of you who were lucky enough to try those. Now specs wise, it's mostly the same as the Invicta Vanguard 2.0. It's 16.45 inches long, 16 millimeters thick, and has a weight range between 7.7 and 8.1 ounces. There is one pretty important change though that they kind of snuck in there without talking much about. The handle is now 5.5 inches long instead of 5.25. I'm super happy about that. It wasn't the end of the world with the Invicta, but I was always a little annoyed that the handle was so short. This is more along the lines of what the rest of the industry is doing, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I think this is a better handle length for an elongated paddle. The last spec to mention would be that this is not thermoformed. Again, they're adamant about doing things their own way. They are saying this has a traditional build and that this time-tested paddle design provides a solid feel, enhanced durability, and more control. I love it. There are so many subtle digs in their marketing stuff. It's quite funny. But honestly, sometimes it's like, come on guys. Like almost half an ounce of variance on your spec tolerance is crazy, especially when you're claiming that all this US made stuff is so much better than what everyone else is doing. I'm not trying to be a Selkirk hater, I just find it kind of funny, and my demo weighed 8.1 ounces for anyone who cares. The reality is, with their whole non-thermoform, time-tested paddle design thing, they're not wrong. Thermoform paddles are great because they provide such a powerful and spinny response, but they don't provide much of that classic pickleball softness. That's one area where the Vanguard 2.0s and now these raw carbon Vanguard controls are absolutely fantastic. They are significantly softer than any of the most popular thermoform paddles, which means they absolutely excel when you need that forgiving feel on a touch shot. On resets, on dinks, on any type of motion that involves slowing down your stroke, you get that extended dwell time, which gives you a sensation of control that you simply will not have with the most rigid thermoform paddles. But the reason a lot of players still like thermoform paddles in the soft game is because that rigid feel is more solid, it's more responsive, which can make for a better connection to the ball. If you're more connected to the ball, then you can get dialed into the control game despite the paddle maybe not being technically very soft. That's also why I've begun to have such a problem with the Vanguard 2.0s. As soft as they are, I find them a little bit mushy and their sweet spots too muted and undefined, especially the more I've gotten used to playing with very rigid, responsive thermoform paddles. So I actually really struggle to play with a Vanguard 2.0, even in the soft game, just because I have no feel for the ball, Well, they haven't thermoformed these paddles, but the feel is night and day better, which I am so happy about. The raw carbon top sheet plays a very big role in that. Really, the word raw describes it perfectly. It just feels like there's less stuff coming in between me and the ball. That better feel also has a lot to do with the X5 Plus honeycomb core. It's just a little more refined than the X5, especially in terms of the amount of feedback that you get, again, because it's not overly muted. It still does a great job of expanding the sweet spot to make these paddles super stable and forgiving like you would expect from a Vanguard branded paddle, but it doesn't totally kill the feel and vibrations like the X5 core did on the 2.0s. Basically, you combine that raw carbon with the better core, and they've taken the touch and control game to the next level, and I think especially high level players will really appreciate that better overall connection to the ball. Still, don't worry if you did like that forgiving feel of the 2.0 core. This still has a large sweet spot, but it has a better feeling sweet spot, and combining those two makes for a paddle that is both rewarding and forgiving, which is rare and very impressive. Good job, Selkirk. Spin is very interesting with this paddle because it's by far the biggest improvement coming from the Vanguard 2.0s, and yet it still might leave some of you a little bit disappointed if you're used to the most spin-friendly thermoform paddles. The spin potential really lies smack dab in between the two. Comparing this directly to the Vanguard 2.0s was awesome. This raw carbon top sheet provides significantly more grip on the ball. You really feel it dig into the fibers of the carbon when it pockets. On the Vanguard 2.0s, you didn't get that same sensation of extra purchase over the ball from the top sheet, especially after that spray-on grit wore off. Also, making the paddle face a 1/4 of an inch shorter and adding that length to the handle was such an important thing to do because it makes for such a more whippy feel. That's extremely important when you're trying to generate spin on ground strokes. Now, the obvious issue with this paddle is that it's not thermoform, so it's not going to have the same top end spin of the best thermoform paddles, which was a bit of an issue, especially at the beginning of my playtest when I was trying to hit full pace passing shots. Because it doesn't have that instantaneous transfer of spin from your technique into the ball gets lost a little bit in the paddle face, and it shoots out a little more randomly than it does with thermoform paddles. I kept thinking of the word sticky while I was hitting ground strokes. I wanted the ball to react a little more instantaneously, and I really had to focus on guiding my shots rather than just whacking at the ball knowing that the spin would control my power. Now that's okay, Selkirk isn't trying to pass this off as a super rigid thermoform paddle. If you want that softness, you have to sacrifice top end spin, but honestly, I got used to that side of this paddle pretty quickly, and as soon as I learned to tone it down a bit, I was fine. The soft spin game here is absolutely elite. Honestly, better than OG super rigid thermoform paddles because you get that extra little bit of pocketing to control the spin. I love that feeling of the ball sinking into the paddle and then being able to do a quick little tweak of the wrist to unleash those deadly low dipping passing shots. It does require finesse, but unlike the Vanguard 2.0s, you can combine spin and finesse, which is something Selkirk should be very proud of because they've managed to mesh classic pickleball technique with the more modern side of things. Still, I need to reiterate, these are not going to rival the most spin-friendly thermoform paddles in terms of outright RPMs. That's just not the type of paddles these are. Now, power is very similar to spin, as you would expect considering it's not thermoformed. The thing with power is that there isn't really any soft power shot the way there is a soft spin shot, so that extra softness doesn't really do anything good for power, unless of course you consider it taking away a bit of power actually a good thing. Now this might not make any sense, but hear me out. Super powerful, super rigid paddles, they're great at helping you put away shots, but that extra power can also be a little uncontrollable at times. Because this longer dwell time tones down that power, for some players that may end up giving you the confidence you need to hit out a little harder, knowing that it's not going to be as powerful of a shot, which ironically could end up making the paddle more powerful in the long run. If you can swing harder because you're confident that your shot is not going to go out, then that harder swing is going to make your shot more powerful. Still, that is going to vary from person to person. The reality is that this is not a very inherently powerful paddle. It is a little more powerful than the Vanguard 2.0 because it's not quite as muted, but still less than anything thermoformed. The Vanguard Control Invikta is really made for two types of players. One, for those of you who have been playing with the Vanguard 2.0s but want something a lot more well-rounded, especially on the spin side of things. The sweet spot is still very big and the paddle is very stable. It still has great soft control and even better feel, but the paddle is just significantly more competitive with what the rest of the industry has to offer in 2024. What that also means is that they're opening themselves up to a way wider player base. The Vanguard 2.0s, even when they came out 2 years ago, were really only made for players focused on touch and control. We may not have had thermoform paddles back then, but we already had paddles that were way better for spin and even for power. But now, I think everybody should at least consider these paddles. The spin and power may not be at the top end of things, but there's still more than enough, especially if you know how to manipulate the ball using a little bit more finesse. And really good players may actually appreciate the more calm nature of this paddle. Generally, if you're good, you can generate power and spin. That's really no problem. As long as you don't feel like you're limited in those, a paddle that has better control may actually be a good thing for your game. You just need to keep in mind that this isn't a ball basher paddle. For those of you who are looking to play purely power and spin, there are better options. For now though, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of the new raw carbon Vanguard control paddles, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.